Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Benko. I teach biology at Sonoma State, and I'm a member of the Alliance. I've been asked to introduce the panel today. I'd like to make it brief because we have an elaborate panel. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Gloria Lyon for arranging for some of our speakers and tell her that we're going to miss her at her other appearance, which she can't make because of the previous engagement. Our speakers today represent a cross-section of experiences on the Holocaust. They deal with survival. They are, from my left, Myra Sheleb, Dr. Renee Molho, Gloria Lyons, Dr. John Steiner, whom you know, and Odette Meyers, next to Dr. Steiner. I'll turn the panel over to you now.
What I think we should be doing is not just to give accounts of all the sufferings which are well known, but also try to interpret what we have been able to understand through that suffering and what we have learned from it. So otherwise, if there is no meaning to all what has happened, it would be very difficult for us to help to prevent future occurrences. And I think the important thing why we are here to discuss our experience is to facilitate interpretation of that experience, make meaningful to those who have not experienced what we have experienced. So I think that's the major objective of why we are here and why we want to share with you what we have experienced in the various camps. I also like to make very clear that there are 4 types of camps. Many people are not aware of that. First of all, there are ghettos, and before the ghettos were concentration camps. Concentration camp, the first one which made in 1933, which was Dachau, and that was primarily for political deviants who opposed the Nazi regime. Obviously, people who opposed the Nazi regime were not merely people who were politically active, but there are also people who, of all walks of life, which included Jews. But the majority of people who were in Dachau in 1933 and 1934 were people who were political ones, and they were the majority. The minority were Jewish. Then, of course, later on, there are many more camps established, and we need to distinguish between concentration camps, which concentrated people who were defined as deviants, and then we've had ghettos, which were primarily, of course, primarily for Jewish people who were supposed to be deviants, who were actually branded and assigned roles of criminals, genetic criminals, in other words, who were incorrigible and therefore were not to come out ever out of any camp. They had to die there. And then we've had slave labor camps, which were established primarily after 1943. And these slave labor camps utilized inmates of concentration camps of all walks of life, Jewish, non-Jewish as well, in order to help armament efforts because of the shortage of manpower which existed during World War II, particularly towards the end, where all people had to fight for Germany, and therefore there was a tremendous shortage of human workers, work power. And the most important and the most terrible one, of course, were destruction camps such as Treblinka, Auschwitz-Birkenau, which were established to destroy people, to eradicate, so these are the major camps. Then one which is another camp which was established primarily for non-Jewish people were the camps for people who were branded and defined as work-shy, people who tried to escape the work potential which was mobilized during World War II. These tend to so-called camps for their work shy and had a very specific separate designation. They're separate from concentration camps and were very deadly. Most people were beaten to death and worked to death. And most of these people were indeed German citizens who were in these camps. So that just as an introduction as to what types of camps there were, because there is a difference in terms of the terrible experience people had. There is a difference in terms of how much people suffered in the different camps. And obviously the death camps were the most deadly, which does mean those people who were not in death camps did not suffer. But there are different degrees of suffering, and that's what I wanted to bring up. Perhaps the least deadly, but nevertheless deadly, were the slave labor camps, because there it was possible for people to find ways and means to survive, provided they had the resilience, they had the right age, so that they could be circumspect and respond to the various situations in the camps and take advantage of it, be as able to interact in a way which would save their life. That much for the basic introduction. Then you will, I'm sure, have plenty of other questions which we'll be happy to answer after we have had the various individual accounts. Perhaps we could start with you.
Before, my dear friends, I start to share with you my life story. Allow me, please, just to share with you just a little thought. You know, I'm also a full-time student, like you, my friends, and I finished a midterm test in biology, and now I have to switch, you know, and to be able to tell you my life story. I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm ready. Okay. Yeah, I'm going. My name is Mira Shelup. I was born in Poland. I was raised in Poland, and I went to school in Poland. I studied in one of the schools in Wilno. Wilno, as you know, is a beautiful town in Poland, which was considered the cradle of the Jewish literature. I was fortunate enough that I could attend one of the schools in Wilno. Yet, in 1939, Germany concluded a non-aggression pact with Russia. And at that point, Poland was torn apart. The western part was taken away by the Germans, the eastern part by the Russians, and Wilno was taken away by the Lithuanians. In other words, it became the capital of Lithuania. I couldn't return to Wilno anymore. In spite of this non-aggression pact, Germany, in 1941, attacked Russia. It took them 2 weeks to occupy Poland. Polish cities, Polish towns were under the German regime. And I would like to stress on the 2 weeks, because it took also the same, the Germans to destroy the ghetto in Warsaw and to destroy the brave heroes of the resistance in Warsaw. The same 2 weeks as it took them to occupy Poland. Polish cities, Polish towns were under the German regime. The Germans' goal, first, to eliminate the minorities in general, and the Jews in particular. And in order to achieve this goal, they had 2 tasks. One, to eliminate all the intellectuals, all the professionals, in other words, all the elements who were capable to organize and resist. And the second goal was to form ghettos a ghetto, a designated part of town, where Jews were pushed into this particular area. In order for you to get a better understanding, a better picture of this situation, I would like to inject a personal experience. We were a family of 6, and we lived in 4 rooms, large rooms. Another 4 families, 5 families, were pushed into our living quarters. Altogether, we were about 40 people. It wasn't easy, it wasn't pleasant, yet we had no choice, and we had to make the best out of everything. Ghetto life was difficult, it was hard. And soon, the youth became restless. Rumors started to spread around in the ghetto about partisans who live in the woods and who fight against the enemy. Soon, they started to liquidate the ghetto. As men and women were pushed into trucks, they were driven away, and they were never seen again. Young men and women escaped from the ghetto to the woods and joined the partisans. In the partisans, I met the handsome, brave partisan who fought a courageous battle against the enemy for better days and a better life, and to take revenge for the ones who perished in such a horrible, unbelievable manner. He happened to be the only survivor of a beautiful family. He was the leader of the group, and he became my life companion. In the woods, in the partisans, where did we live in the woods? Where did we get our food, our ammunition, and what was our goal? The sky, the trees, the pine needle ground was our summer home. The underground hut, our winter home. We were dealing with friendly and unfriendly peasants. The friendly peasants supplied us with food and ammunition. And the unfriendly peasants had no choice. We would get in at night, pick up prepared food orders, which were prepared for the Germans, and leave receipts. The Germans were here, and they picked up the orders. What was our goal? We were not interested in getting involved in open battle fights because we were not equipped or trained for it. We were interested in getting involved in sabotage acts to interrupt and disrupt the transportation and communication to the front, as we blew up trains and as we attacked local police stations. Soon we made contact with the Russian headquarters in the forests, and they supplied us with ammunition and information about the front. In 1944, we were liberated by the Russians. We are again free men and women. We are anxious to go back to our towns. We had to say goodbye to the woods, to the birds, to the trees, to each other, to the evenings when we would sit around a fire, caring and sharing for each other, singing songs together, and dreaming about better days and a better life. And now, we have to say goodbye to each other. Leave for the cities and towns and to start a new life. That was in Poland. We were anxious at that point to leave Poland. To leave Poland, we left for Austria, for Czechoslovakia, and our aim was to reach the American zone in order to leave Europe. Our aim was to go to Israel. We were counting how many borders we'll have to cross in order to get to Israel. But since some of us, my husband, was the only survivor of a big family. And since the relatives in the United States, they found out that, like my husband, who was the only survivor, they started to bombard us with letters to come to the United States. And we did come to the United States. We worked very hard with my husband. We brought up a beautiful family, a nice business. And when the time came to enjoy the fruit of the hard work, I lost my husband. And at that point I felt it's over. I couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. But life goes on. You open up new avenues, and I went back to school. And I'm just like you, my dear friends, a full-time student. My message to you as an ex-partisan: never say that it is too late. Never say that it is the last road. Never say that you cannot see the light at the end of the tunnel. Dreams, hopes can come true. I am a full-time student like you, my dear friends. Now, if you have some questions, I guess later on I'll be able to answer.
I'll try to be as brief as possible. My name is Renee Molho. I was born in Salonika, Greece. I've got a French education. My Salonika, I want to make an exception to the lady's statement. Salonika was the cradle of Jewish literature. There is a difference. You see, people use Jewish instead of using the word Yiddish. Vilna is the cradle of Yiddish literature, while Salonika was the cradle of Sephardic literature. We don't speak Yiddish, we speak Spanish, which is Ladino.
That's okay.
An interval. I was, when the Germans come to Salonika, I will try to be very brief to allow time for questions. We were taken and segregated into ghettos. We had to wear the Jewish tar. All our Jewish business was taken away, and the Germans decreed that we were going to Poland to work for, even allowed us to take with us warm clothing and blankets, food, and they even changed our gold dollars or our gold money for zlotys, which is the Polish money. We were parked in trains, we call them those trains, in cattle trains, parked one against the other, and it took there about 6 days to arrive to Auschwitz. You heard all about Auschwitz. Right there, the infamous Dr. Mengele started making actions. My father and mother were sending to the gas chamber right away. My brother and I went into camp. Right next to Auschwitz were the crematorium, burning bodies day and night. We were living with that smell. And although the smell was there for 4 months, my brother and I could not believe that they were killing and gassing people. We thought that they were just gassing dead bodies. We thought our father was in the next camp, which actually was a women's camp. It took us 4 months to come to, I would say, to really realize that our parents were gassed. After we were there about 9 months, my brother was chosen for sexual experiments. We all know more or less what was going on in Auschwitz. If somebody is interested, I will give an explanation later. As I say, I want to go very fast. And my brother, of course, survived, and he died there. What went on into the extermination camps is impossible to describe. You know probably that Hungarian children were burned alive in pits because the crematorium could not burn them as fast as possible. Well, I was in the place where 6 million Jews perished. I was one of the few who was lucky to come out alive. I was also lucky to be liberated by the Americans who feed slowly and nursed me back to health, and I was able to come back. And it took us a long time to really be able to talk about it, but I want to take a few seconds to stress a point. It has to be known that during the Hitler occupation from 1939 to 1945, no nation raised their hand to help the 6 million Jews dead. Nobody lifted a finger, and nobody can say they didn't know about it because they knew about it, and I can prove it. Several books have been written about that, but the shame of humanity lays, starting with the Vatican, finishing with the Roosevelt administration, that nobody laid a finger to help the dead. And that is the shame of the modern history, and I hope it will never be repeated. Thank you.
My name is Gloria Lyon. I was 14 years old when the, let me go back one step. I'm sorry, I'm having a bad start. I was actually 8 years old when the Hungarians occupied this part of Czechoslovakia where I was born after the Munich Agreement, or as a result of the Munich Agreement. And then in 1944, when I was 14, I was placed and together with my family, and then taken 4 weeks later to Auschwitz, where I spent nearly 8 months. When we arrived, we also were selected by Dr. Mengele, and I was sent to live, and my sister Anushka was sent with the old people and the children and the sick and the disabled to perish. But of course we didn't know this at that time. The men were sent in another direction where another selection took place. My brother, prior to leaving the ghetto, from the ghetto actually, was selected to go into a labor camp rather than into the military. He was of military age. He was 20 years old. We worked across the street from crematorium number 2. We sorted the clothing of the people who were still perish, and also our clothes, which we had to give up. And then we received, we were processed, of course, and received a great cotton uniform. Our heads were shaven, our arms were tattooed. I'm still bearing the number A6374 tattooed on my lower left arm, which he also has. Do you have a number, that letter before yours, Flanagan?
No.
I'm going to ask you a question later.
Yes, I will.
Thanks. And then we were assigned to barracks, and of course we learned there a few days later, before starting work, how naive we were from the old-timers, the Jews from Holland, France, and Belgium, and Germany, and so on. With us were other inmates also who were non-Jews, and we had different insignias to indicate what we were there for, apparently. I didn't know what it meant at the time, except that Jews had a particular insignia to wear, and political prisoners had something else, and I think you probably know about these various insignias from Dr. Steiner. Our days were very long. We had to get up at 3 o'clock. There were groups who had to get up at 4, but we had to get up at 3 o'clock, and we stood in line. We called Zählapell, head count, till 6 o'clock to wear us down, at which time we would be counted, and periodically entire rows of us would be sliced off, sent away, never to be seen again. And this would be sometimes from one end, sometimes from another, and sometimes from the middle, so that one never felt safe anywhere. then at 7 o'clock when we would march to work, we would always see human bodies against the electric wire fences. They committed suicide. They gave up. Our food was meager, and I will not even describe it, for really what little there was of it could hardly be described food. Our term was open-ended. We didn't know when it would be our turn. Consequently, it affected us tremendously. Most of us lost our loved ones. I was together with my mother and my sister. My sister, I mentioned earlier, was selected to go with the other group. However, a wagon came toward our way as we were walking toward a direction we were instructed to go, and my sister was on it, just sitting on its ledge with her feet dangling down. And as this wagon caught up with our row, she just jumped off and joined us. And later we learned that she saved her life by doing this. She worked with us. She was 12 years old, and toward the end of December, I was selected by Dr. Mengele. This was about the 5th selection that I can recall, and there may have been more. I was taken away from my mother and sister and sent to the other side. As the wagon, the truck rather, came to take us away in the middle of the night, and I was on my way to the gas chamber, and it crossed the wagon, the truck crossed into the next camp section of Auschwitz, and I jumped off the slow-moving truck and I hid in a culvert. I was in that culvert that night and the following day until the following night without any food or clothing. And then I decided that if I stayed in that culvert, I will die from the elements. And so I crawled back up to the roadside and I made my way into the nearest barrack. I climbed up to the 3rd bunk, and a woman woke up, started to scream, and I just quieted her down. She gave me her overcoat and I stayed there. And unknown to any of us at the time, the following morning we were all lined up and we were counted and we were taken to the railroad platform and we were counted off and taken away from Auschwitz. My next camp was Bergen-Belsen. And there I spent my 15th birthday. Following Bergen-Belsen, we were shipped out to the city of Braunschweig, and there we were hired out by the SS to the township of Braunschweig to clear the streets of debris so that the German vehicles or artillery could pass through. Following Braunschweig, we were sent to Hamburg, where we did the same thing, and then to Hanover, where we were hired out by the SS to the local industrialists. And there we worked in a gas mask factory in the County Gummiwerke, making gas masks, and on an assembly line. We had 12-hour shifts, not including the time it took to go to work and to come back from work. And following that, we were shipped out to Bendorf, which was an underground factory where they made the V-2 rockets, the rockets that the Germans used to bombard London during World War II. We were trained by German civilians, and we encountered some kind of civilians here and there in Braunschweig. For example, I remember a little old lady with a French bread tucked under her arm and just stooped down and really looking to see when it would be the right time to throw us the bread. Also in Bendorf, I encountered a very kind man who was assigned to work to me, and we could not really talk to each other except about our work because we were constantly watched by the guard, but he still managed to slip part of his lunch to me once in a while. And this was a tremendously courageous act, I felt, on the part of these Germans. but we must remember that there was some kindness out there also. By this time, I was really beginning to show the strain, the physical strain, and my body, even little scratches just festered and became deeper and larger and became infected. And as we worked in the salt mine, Bendorf, in the ammunition factory, the salt constantly rubbed against these wounds, and they were extremely painful. And tearing part of my dress was against the concentration camp rules and punishable by death if discovered. But we simply managed to go on, and we were suddenly shipped out again and was taken to Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück was a women's experimental camp. It was notorious for that. But thank God I did not participate in that, in any of those experiments. We spent our time marching and just delousing each other so that we could get a good night's sleep, and because the vermin was really eating us up, because by this time we had not bathed for months and months, simply infested with lice. Then we were packed into cattle cars very tightly, and for 3 days the train kept moving and stopping apparently without any aim. And about half or more of the people died. We had no choice but to sit on the dead bodies. And finally the train stopped in a large open meadow, and we heard the Nazis outside discuss our fate. We were shot here, executed. Well, all these different reactions set in. Some people sobbed, others became delirious, and still others fell into deep apathy. I remember I just could not believe that after all I've endured, it would end like this. And then the doors were shoved open, and we were ordered, rouse, rouse, and stand in line. And to my amazement, they were doling out one handful of macaroni, raw macaroni, and one handful of sugar, just plain sugar, to each of the prisoners. And at that point, I held up my gray dress to receive this ration, and I was beaten unconscious when I tried to pick up the macaroni, at least, that spilled on the tall grass. And I really came to when I've heard voices that we were crossing the Danish countryside and that we would be in Copenhagen soon, and a man's voice saying, "You're very lucky, you are free, I'm back." And when I opened my eyes, I was on a real civilian train. And indeed, the train stopped in Copenhagen, and their beautiful faces, smiling, greeted us with brown bags with all sorts of goodies in it. And we ate, and we became ill from overeating. But it was really their concern and humanity that we needed. And then we were placed on a ferry boat and taken across the Öresund to Sweden, where we started a new life. And I'll be glad to give you more information later, but I'm sorry I couldn't give you a more concise report. Thank you. We arrived in Malmö, Sweden, to answer your question, on May 3rd, 1945, and this was a few days before the war ended. We were, a very important part of my report was that we were actually rescued, Count Folk Bernadotte, from Sweden. And the reason that we were not executed is because he made a deal with Himmler well, actually, he went to talk to Himmler, and he asked for the release of the Scandinavian prisoners. But after a while, Himmler could see which way the wind was blowing, and he was going to save his neck, and he decided he told Bernadotte all out of Ravensbrück. But I was already taken out of Ravensbrück and nearly lost my life in the open countryside. And so when the White Fleet emptied all the women from Ravensbrück, this White Fleet caught up with our train, and we were included with it. And so it was that we were freed. Thank you. don't have time to go into any of the whys and wherefores.
That's right. My name is John Steiner, and I was in just about 6 camps, different types of camps, concentration camps, ghettos, destruction camps, slave labor camps, and so forth. I think before I'll give you some episodes, because they have to be sporadic because of the lack of time to us, just wanted to say the following, which will perhaps better help you to see in what sort of a state a person was who was taken out of circulation. As a normal citizen, just as you and I here now, stripped of all the roles which you and I play in daily interaction. Some of you are pupils, or some are students. I can see young people there. And told that they're criminals, that they were incorrigible criminals, and treated accordingly. So this transition was a tremendous trauma. The fact that you are in normal sort of circles, so to speak, normal circles. They're not quite normal because World War II had already started and things were very bad. But still, people at their homes, to some extent, they may have lived in crowded circumstances, but still it was a relatively normal life. All of a sudden, they are taken out of that, stripped of their humanity, assigned a role. You are a criminal, you have to be destroyed, you are a swine, you are vermin, you need to be destroyed. This transition was, of course, terrible. Not only the psychological one, but of course the physical, which accompanied the psychological trauma, so that people were totally unprepared to deal with novel circumstances, novel situations. Now, what psychologists tell us, that intelligence is the ability to adjust to novel situations. That is exactly what people had to do if they wanted to survive. Now, depending on the age and the resilience, the health, the state of health, that was one of the basic things which helped them either to survive, to adjust to these novel circumstances. So the first few months were crucial. To what extent people were able to adjust and maintain resilience and be alert in order to take advantage of any sort of break situation which looked like a break, to survive. Because deprivation was not only in food, but people were killed, beaten to death. And the terrible thing is that not only those who were indeed the originators of all that evil, the SS, to be very specific, were not necessarily those you came directly in contact with. The people whom you had to fear most were your own fellow inmates, who became overseers, who were functions, inmate functionaries, who were supervising you, and if you did not comply to the orders, if need be, killed you, beat you to death, kicked you to death. So this is something which one needs to understand in order to appreciate the terrible transition which took place, to which many people couldn't adjust, particularly when they were old, and as a consequence died. Because what was most important is to adjust to these novel situations and be alert enough to see what you could do in order to survive, to get the extra crumb of the bread, to get an extra slice of a bread, and if necessary, steal, not necessarily from your fellow inmates, which also happened, but from those who had more, namely those, the SS, or those people who were in charge of us. Now, that is, I think, a very important thing to realize, to appreciate what people had to go through and to adjust. Now, as a person who has not committed any crime, and most Jews, of course, were in that position, it was very difficult for them now to assume guilt for something they have never committed and accept the role which was assigned to them, namely that of incorrigible criminals. Many of them were confused, didn't know what to do and find meaning in their predicament. And because they couldn't find meaning in the predicaments, there was tremendous chaos, psychologically, emotionally. And if they couldn't find meaning, and if they could not muster enough strength and self-discipline to stay alert and stay relatively healthy, they had no prayer to survive. It was simple. Now, in 1942, after Heydrich, who was the protector, the deputy of Hitler, sent to the occupied, what was formerly Czechoslovakia, was assassinated in May 1942. And as a consequence, and many other reasons, they rounded up all the people who now would have to pay for the fact that he had been assassinated by Czech people who were parachuted, military people parachuted to Czechoslovakia to kill him. Now, Heydrich played a very important role because he was in charge of the Reich's security department, which was directly under Himmler, and he was second in charge next to Himmler. He was his right-hand man. Now, this assassination was, there was a tremendous retribution, and many people were rounded up. I was one of them, because I had no part in it, didn't play any part in his assassination. They didn't care, so many people were like hostages taken to camps, and I was one of them, along with some other reasons, because they could find some Jewish ancestry in my background. So I was brought to Theresienstadt, which was at that time the ghetto for the more prominent people, for people who were first shipped from Central Europe to Theresienstadt, primarily Czechs, some Germans, and some people from different countries like Holland, but primarily Czechs and Germans, Austrians. Now, that camp was a good camp to be in to begin with, because the conditions were relatively to other camps mild, but not mild enough that people didn't die by the thousands. People were not gassed there. They were not that frequently mistreated, except they had to survive under tremendous deprivation. So from that particular ghetto, people were shipped to destruction camps. As of 42, particularly 42 and 43, they were sent to destruction camps. And there are some people who were not sent, who were exempt, simply because they had particular positions. They were world-renowned scientists, and they had privileges. They had privileges in that particular ghetto, one of which was to get better rations and also not to be shipped to destruction camps. Then you had another group of people, those who were working hard and did not have any privileges, and then the ones who were in charge, who were known as the Judenrat, the ghetto elders who were in charge, and they, of course, were exceedingly frequently very corrupt and collaborated with the Germans. And that is something which I wanted to mention. Very frequently that is misunderstood. People under pressure, if they have no other alternatives and see that there is a possibility to survive, even to collaborate with the Germans, the Nazis, or indeed the persecutors, did so in order to save their skin at the expense of other people. And that is something which I wanted to... How did people survive all these unbelievable circumstances, the hell which they had to go through? Did they retain their morality, or did they become demoralized? And some did become demoralized, other people retained their moral values so that they survived, but not at the expense of other people, by assuming, for example, positions which served the interests of the Nazis, indeed the persecutors. Now, from Theresienstadt, then, many of us, and the majority, were shipped to destruction camps as of 1942. And many people were sent immediately to the gas chamber, to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Some were sent to other places. but primarily to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where they were gassed. Now, the interesting thing is when I was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the transport which came there, just about close to 1,000 people, were exempt for reasons which still escape me from being gassed immediately. So we were given privileged status for reasons which I still have not been able to ascertain. And our hair was not cut. Most of the other people's hair was cut. And we were sent to the so-called family camp, which was the B camp, B2 camp in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and stayed there for a very, very long time. Periodically, then doctors came and selected those who were incurably ill, because the conditions there were, of course, much worse than in Theresienstadt. There was lack of food, there was lack of support, there was nothing you could do in order to escape all your predicament, so you had to stay and suffer or be killed on the spot, either by fellow inmates or shot by the SS. So not much of a choice, to be sure. So the people who were young, of course, had a better chance, but periodically then people came, the authorities, the SS came to cleanse the place of those who were considered to be incurably ill or were so sick, and they were to gas chambers. And one group of people who came before me were sent to gas chambers in spite of the fact that they were totally healthy, but the order came from Berlin that they were to be gassed, so anyone who had a number below my number I have were rounded up in this B2 camp and sent to the gas chamber. And what happened, because my closest friends were in that situation, and that is something which is very important, because you were absolutely helpless to do anything in order to save people from that predicament, because how do you defend yourself against a powerful enemy of that nature? It was virtually impossible to do so. Although we had organized, which was a kind of naive and very childish sort of situation, some resistance while I was there under the leadership of a very well-known young Zionist. Freddie Hirsch was his name, and he has written about him quite a bit. Now he organized us, the young people, some of them just as old as some of you are here, and you know, there was sort of a blueprint for a resistance. And when he was rounded up, and the other young people who were with him, they couldn't resist. There was nothing in terms of resistance at all. It was all talk, and he committed suicide rather than let himself be gassed by the Germans. So Auschwitz-Birkenau was a place where resistance was very, very difficult. Now, people said, why there was no resistance? Well, the means were not available, and to resist meant also to develop and maintain a will to survive. And that was the real resistance which all of us, or most of us, developed, who indeed survived, because without the will of resistance, there was absolutely no way you could survive. And that is something which has not been written about very much, that indeed the resistance was to develop and maintain a will to survive, which was under those circumstances exceedingly difficult. Now, again, I'd like to stress, the younger you were, the better your chances. The older you were, the less of a chance you've had to survive. That means if a person was over 30, so to speak, they deteriorated much more quickly than those who were still in their teens, and you and I were in the teens when we came there, so therefore we were still somehow more resilient than people who were over 30. Those who were over 30 looked within a very short time like 50, and those who were 40 looked like 60 and 70, and those who were 70 or 60 had absolutely no way to survive, because they could not develop the resilience and could not maintain the alertness to adjust to novel situations. Now, let me just give you a very short episode from Auschwitz-Birkenau. Some of us who were still relatively able-bodied, if we say relatively able-bodied, it's just ridiculous because we all were walking X-rays. And that's the best way to describe walking X-rays. So those walking X-rays who still could run in front of Mengele, that is my last encounter with Mengele, we had to strip and run and prove that we still could run. That was the proof of our ability that we could be employed as slave laborers in one place which was called Blechhammer. Blechhammer was a industrial plant which produced synthetic gasoline, synthetic fuel, and that was a very important place because it provided the war effort with synthetic fuel, which was hard to, and fuel was very hard to come by. So this syn fuel we had to produce along with prisoners of war, most of whom were British and Canadian. And in this situation, where we more or less worked side by side, although we were separate, some of us who were indeed still alert and resilient could make contacts. And I was able to make a contact with a laborer who was sent there from Czechoslovakia but was not an inmate, was relatively free, and I arranged with him to make contacts with my family, my relatives, so that he received parcels from them whom they could send to him directly. Of course, they couldn't send any parcels to Blechhammer, to that slave labor camp, to inmates. So he received the parcels, and I took them from him at some particular place where we were relatively unguarded and where both of us could come. And then I took the camp and shared it, and I've said that where I was with my father, because my father and I were sent there to the same place at the same time. We were in the same transport, which was very helpful, because indeed most of the people who were related were either taken apart from each other, they were simply separated, or they were killed. Now, in my case, I was at least together with my father, which was very helpful because we supported each other. Now, by virtue of the fact that he was that much older, I was the one who now assumed the role of the father to take care of him, because he was not able-bodied at all. So I had to start taking care of him and support him with all the things which I was able, because I was more alert, to organize, as we call it, to organize. And thereby he survived and I survived. Well, one day, for example, when I was just what they called contraband, when I had just received medical supply, food, and all sorts of valuables from this Czech worker who had been sent these things from my friends and relatives, I was caught by a person who was known as the most vicious SS man in the camp, whom we called Tom Mix. That was his nickname. Well, Tom Mix, because he always immediately drew the pistol and shot the people without any sort of trial whatsoever. And so he caught me, and immediately, and then I said, well, that's the end of the road, because I had my knapsack full of contraband and what have you, and I said, at the very moment I opened it, well, people were hung for lesser reasons if, for example, we had very frequent air raids there. Well, because that was a war industry which was exceedingly important. So we had air raids, but we were not permitted to go into any air shelters. That was reserved for prisoner of wars and non-Jewish inmates. Well, that is to say, non-Jewish, no inmates were permitted into these shelters. So during these air raids, of course, we were able to take advantage of this situation because we were not supervised at all and could organize some things, and also were not bothered. So the time when I really could sleep unbothered was precisely during these air raids. And all the other people were just, bombs were falling all over the place, and I slept soundly because I felt psychologically relieved of all the supervision which not let me alone. Now, in this connection, I just wanted to say this was the condition, and after an air raid, if you, for example, You used a piece of wiring which you could pick up from the ground and put it in your shoes, which were canvas and wooden shoes, and use it as airlace, as shoelace. Then if they caught you, you were hung. And Saturday and Sundays were the official days where people were hung, usually on, and that the entire camp had to see, and Tom Mix was exactly the one who rounded them up, and if they would not go by themselves, he would shoot them. So, right, so Tom Mix, coming back to the thing, closing the circle, Tom Mix came and stopped me and say, hey, come here. Now, my German, just so happens, was impeccable, and my appearance was not stereotypically Jewish, which was a very interesting thing. So first time he just said, I don't want to catch you here ever again, or you will be in deep trouble, and just slapped my face lightly at me go without looking at my knapsack. Now these were the risks you had to take, because if you didn't take these risks, you couldn't survive. Who could take these risks? Only people who were relatively able, I say relatively able-bodied. And that, I think, is something which I wanted to explain to you, so that you better appreciate how difficult surviving camps. Now, then, of course, you also could survive if you assumed a certain role, a supervisory role, where you worked along with the SS and mistreated your fellow inmates. And that is something I never would have done. So many of the guilt feeling, many of the people who feel guilt after the fact, feel guilt because the moral conditions have changed. In the camp, it was something which was not necessarily condoned, but it was understood and relatively justifiable. I say relatively justifiable. I don't think it's justifiable. But after the war, when you had different moral conditions, where this sort of thing, in retrospect, was not acceptable, is, of course, a burden to people who survived at the expense of other people. And that is one of the major reasons for guilt. Guilt experienced by survivors. Now, the last thing I wanted to say from there, we, since the Russians were coming in and taking over all the territory, we already heard all the noises and the explosions from the battlefield. Then the able-bodied, again, it's all relative, were rounded up and said, if you don't come, you stay there, the chances are that we'll shoot you, from that particular slave labor camp, Blechhammer. And so my father was not in a position to go on what we call the death march. And therefore he decided to stay, which saved his life, because indeed they are not shot at all, but they actually stayed there unscathed. The SS ran away and the Russians came in and liberated them. And they were actually one of the first to be liberated during World War II in these camps. And that was very close to Auschwitz, Blechhammer. That was a satellite camp of Auschwitz. Now, I had to go, I decided to go on the death march because I was afraid if I would stay there, I would be shot, as they have threatened us. And that was exactly the thing. If you don't go with us, the chances we'll shoot you. All right, so I went, and that was, the death march was one of the most terrible things experienced by all inmates, because we had in these striped pajamas, which were not adequate at all to keep the frost. It was in January, and Polish winters are exceedingly cold and frosty, to say the least. So then we had to march without shelters, without food, for about 10 days. And most of the people died of frostbite. Most of the people died of all sorts of disease, because at times, more frequently than not, we had to sleep in the snow. And so the interesting thing is that the SS, of course, who guarded us, themselves no longer could really supervise us too much. And so many people took advantage, and almost took advantage also to escape. But where to? Because no one would risk to shelter you. So some of my friends decided to indeed escape, but they've never been seen before, because what we didn't know for sure, but gathered that those people who dropped and could not march any further were indeed shot by the rear guard, by the SS. And that's what happened to most of those who all were rounded up, because none of the people assumed the responsible or were courageous enough to support those who had escaped, because that was a death sentence and they knew it. So therefore they were sent back and then immediately shot on the spot. So on that road, and then we came to another camp, several other camps. From there I was shipped to Dachau in a boxcar with about 100 people, and in this open boxcar, the carriage, there are immediately 3 layers. So the first people were thrown into the first time, and all were already sick and disabled, frostbite, what have you. And then came the second layer and the third layer, and the first layer was suffocated by the second layer, the second was suffocated by the third layer, and they all fought for space in an open railway boxcar carriage, and they were trying to avoid suffocation. And that was a deadly fight, one of the worst possible fights. And then some Ukrainian SS who guarded us came and looked at people who moved and simply took a Luger pistol and started shooting at those people who just had moved. And if you were not the lucky one, you got it. And just next to me was sitting, just like in this sort of situation, except closer, was one of my best buddies. And this fellow came, this Ukrainian SS, couldn't speak proper German at all. And he just looked around impassionately, drew his Luger pistol, and looked at this friend of buddy of mine, and he shot him in his throat, and I could see him die. And these sort of things happen all the time. The dead people were not permitted to be thrown out because we were not supposed to leave any traces. So that people, most of the people who had died were decomposed, and the only way for us to survive was to be on top of the heap, so that we would not be killed by other inmates who fought for air, so that they would not be suffocated. In that state we arrived in Dachau. Out of 100, there are just about 10 people had survived, and there are just about 800 people, eight railway boxcars. Out of these 800, just about at the most 80 had survived, and I was one of them. Then we were, the reception committee of Dachau SS came and took us out, and they broke down because of the sight they saw. I've never seen that before, and that they took pity on us. The SS people themselves took pity on us and said, we've never seen anything, and were exceedingly supportive, and those who survived were, so to speak, supported and nourished, got food which other people, other inmates didn't get, because we told them, and I was one of the spokesmen, and said, you can do only 2 things with us. Either you kill us because we can't continue to suffer the way we have, or you have to do something, you have to support us. And that was an officer, yes, there was a, just a charge, of, there was a, what was his, probably a rank of a captain, SS captain, so-called Hauptsturmführer, and he was a very powerful man, which at that time I didn't know, except I know that he was a relatively high-ranking or higher-ranking officer, and he responded and he ordered that we would get special food. And that helped us to survive, the group of which I was the spokesman, and that helped us to survive. Well, this is just in a nutshell some of the things which then they came, and when the Americans came, most of us, of course, were very ill and sick, so we didn't, even with this special positive treatment, not the special treatment as described by the Germans, which meant annihilation, we were still so sick that without medication, without proper medical assistance, it was virtually impossible for us to survive. So when the Americans came to liberate Dachau on the 29th of 1945, I was already virtually blind because of malnutrition, I had frostbite, which was terrible. Some of my toes were already missing, which I just simply threw away, you know, and the bones were sticking out. And I didn't believe that I had a prayer to survive, but I did. And that is just a little bit in a nutshell, a story which might give you a little bit of insight, plus a little bit of as to the chances of survival and how important it was to be young at that particular situation.
Excuse me, can I interject two thoughts on your speech? First of all, yes, I know, but I just want to make two, if I may say, corrections, because I've lived in Auschwitz more than in a... First of all, there was an uprising in the Auschwitz crematorium. One of the crematorium was blown out. Actually, there is a survivor right there who helped blow it out. Secondly, you talked about guilt. Well, not only the people who were capos or Straubenschutz felt guilt, but all of us, when we were liberated, felt guilt because we were just alive while our parents, friends, relatives died. It was not, the feeling of guilt was not because we did wrong, but because we were alive and we another died. It's a funny thing, but that's the way it is.
Yeah,
I mean, I just want to make this to...
I'm interested in your ideas, yes. Except the second part I would not necessarily agree with.
Yes, well, I did.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I have a very different story, and it's all on the because I was of a different age. And I think the question of age brought out is very important. I was 5 when the war started, and 7 when they started rounding up the Jews in Paris. I came from France. My name is Odette Meyers. And at that time, if I had been taken to camp, I simply would not have survived. The children didn't. Teenagers perhaps had some chances, but small children didn't have any chance. So, so I will tell you my story, which is really different and brings, I think after all this, some of the light in the darkness. And that is that the reason I was spared the camps is that I was helped, not by governments, because the French government collaborated, not by institutions, or official institutions such as the church, which supposedly was neutral, which was the same as letting us be in danger, but I was helped by individuals. And in some ways, when I think about it, sometimes I tell that story to children. It stuns me even to think of it, that whereby governments act, some individuals did. And so I will tell you my story. I was born in Paris, which is the city of lights, except it got quite dim for a while. But my parents were from Poland, and they were politically aware of what was going on, but like, this is to answer another question nobody asked, but I hear it often, why didn't you Europe on time? My parents were poor. They were working class people. They did have relatives in America, but there was no way they could afford to leave the country. So they remained, like many Jews who could not afford to go, and yet they thought they could go. My father joined the army in 1939, the Polish section of the French army, very complicated, although on his military card it said Jew, so that when he was captured by the Germans, they knew exactly what to do with him, and he was placed in one of the 2 camps for Jewish prisoners of war, and remained there the rest of the war. Of course, that could have been what saved him, probably, as an able-bodied man, Jewish man. My mother remained and was immediately in the resistance. And I want to point out something else, is that beginning, so many of the men did join the army. Other men were taken, so that much was carried on by women and women and their children. And the resistance in France, the Jewish resistance, was full of women, of these women. And one of the first things they decided to consider was to find a way to save the children in case of trouble. Thought out some plans, and they were the ones who initiated negotiations with the French resistance and their network, so that there would be a network of places, Catholic places and families in which to place the children in case of danger. In the meantime, in Paris, we had all kinds of restrictions. The French government collaborated. France is traditionally very anti-Semitic, if everyone knew the Dreyfus affair, and that remained in the atmosphere. When we had to register, and later on we had to wear the star, it was very hard not to. For instance, you could think, well, why did they not register and get away from it? Simply because your neighbor would denounce you. That's all there was to it. They would denounce you, you know, figuring that if you're taken away, they could get your apartment or your radio, anything, yeah? Like that. So we felt in a very hostile world, essentially. You could not trust anybody. And oddly enough, when I think of it, of my mother doing clandestine world inside of that hostile world, it sounds very complicated, especially since next door lived a woman who was a mistress of a Gestapo officer, just and so on. And we had people knock at the door from the resistance with, you know, code words and so on. We had the very good luck, incredibly good luck, of having as a concierge in our building, the concierge is like the apartment manager, a woman who was almost illiterate, and but really, I think maybe because of it, she was very intelligent, naturally intelligent. She did papers. She thought for herself, you know? And I think that maybe for that, she figured things out for herself. And she was absolutely determined that no one would take us, period. Figure that out. But she just, that's it. She was big and round, and she was going to protect us, period. And she was very, very protective, but still, one day in July of '42, the roundups came as a total surprise. And it was early in the morning, about 5 o'clock. We were sleeping upstairs, my mother and I, and suddenly, I don't know how she was awake or what, she came to our apartment and yanked us out of bed and said, they're coming for you. And she took us into her apartment and put us into a broom closet. Then, and from there we could hear. And what we heard was she greeted the team, the search team, with great cries of enthusiasm. Oh, what a wonderful job you're doing. How wonderful that you are reading the Friends of All Jews. You must come in and have a glass of wine, of my best wine, etc. And she talked a lot of anti-Semitic things and did draw into her apartment and did offer them wine and chatted and chatted and chatted and said all kinds of awful things. And at one point, they got one of them got suspicious and said, we're going to go upstairs and check it out. When they asked about us, she said, oh, Jews, you know, they act as though they're poor, they live in places like that, but they all have money, they have a country house, they're away, and so on. The danger was that if they had gone upstairs and entered the apartment, they would know immediately that no one was really, and they would have searched, and she would have been taken, of course. And so she started, she got even more anti-Semitic and said, oh, Jews are really, they're such bad housekeepers, you know, Germans are immaculate and so on and so on and so on. So they got discouraged, and they drank some more, and after a while, they went on. Now, we were saved, and all the Jews on our block managed to hide, number one, because it was time enough, because the trucks were coming down. All right, so after that, she did many other things later on. That was the beginning for her. She did this because she knew us and because she thought it was wrong for Germans to take us away, period. After that, then I connected, so my story is in several parts, then I connected with the plan escaped, that my mother had worked out with the resistance. And we ended up, so it was very complicated, we were immediately told from that moment on, from the time that I was in that closet, with my star, by the way, because we grabbed some clothing and I happened to have a star, that was the last moment during the entire war in which I could openly be a Jew, oddly enough. And I remember a strange feeling about that star, feeling that was it. After that, I could not be a Jew. I knew it. After that, Jew was supposed to exist. What happened to the others on that day were over 13,000 men, mostly women and children, were rounded up, and they were taken into a stadium and left there with only the food or whatever they could have gathered, if they could in such a hurry, for 7 days in the middle of Paris, and no one helped except Quakers, who came and inquired and tried to help in the middle of this city of light. And the Quakers. And of the children who were taken that day, not a single one came back. If only 5% of Jewish children who were in Paris that day survived. So I am one of that number. So I know what would have happened to me if I had been taken. But that's still not the end of the story. As you could hear from the other stories, they all got very complicated. Surviving in those days meant you survived one day, and then something happened months later. You had to survive again and again and again and again. And there were many close calls. But nevertheless, I sort of represent what happened to children, to that generation. So my cousins and many others ended up in camps, didn't come back. I was saved physically first by this woman, and then sent through the resistance network to a village in France and placed in a Catholic home with 3 others to pass as Catholic and to be raised as such and sent to school as such. And I stayed there for 8 months, and later my mother joined me, and then I moved to another identity. We moved to another village, assumed another identity, including the fact that, and this was a very, very backward Catholic village, that in order to not to draw to my father's name or to the existence of my father, I was then declared illegitimate, which is hard to live through if you're in a Catholic village. But there we lived, my mother and I, till the end. We were denounced once. We almost didn't make it. And then we were saved because they are always, I feel I was rescued so many times. This time around it was by a baron who was in the resistance and who saved absolutely the last minute. Otherwise we were already denounced to the Gestapo, and they had as suspected Jews, and they were going to check it out, and that would have been the end. Now, my experience includes another aspect of the Holocaust that's little understood, and that is that because it relates to the children. Those of us who lost our Jewish identity during the war and who assumed a Jewish identity during our formative years did, in fact, in most cases, really believe as Catholics. However, when we were returned to the Jewish community, we were absolutely bewildered, because then overnight we lost our Catholic identity, resumed our Jewish identity, which was very complicated, which was not the same that we remembered, because what we saw were the concentration camp survivors coming back in their pajamas, head shaved, and looking like skeletons. And then we wondered, gee, that's being Jewish, you know. Maybe it was better to be a Catholic peasant. But I want to tell you of, you know, there was a terrible crisis of identity, and our parents were so busy reconstructing the Jewish community that they didn't think about it. They didn't know what to do with that kind of information, that their children had become Catholics during a few years, and they just hoped that it would just go away if you put them in Jewish camps and so on, which is what they did. But I remember during my worst crisis then of identity, I was 10, I remember, and I'll tell you those two little stories, how I was drawn back irrevocably, even more than two, but I'll tell you only two, to being Jewish forever and ever. One of them was that in my little world, my parents' world, which was Yiddish speaking from Poland, they had a tradition of New Year's Day ball, you know, a large dance in a large stadium. Music and dance where they gathered, and then each year they would see each other. And I remember how after the war they planned for the first post-war ball, and how it was, and I went there, and it was extraordinary because everything was still incomplete. You didn't know if people had survived somewhere, somehow. You would find them or not find them. You didn't know all the stories. And at this reunion, people found out stories, and people were crying and laughing, and all these stories at once, all the losses, all those stories. And yet they danced and had that old Yiddish music from Poland that I had missed throughout the war. And when I heard that, and when I saw them dance, I said, I'm so proud to be of these people. And I could never forget that. And the other one was, I had a very, very dear neighbor who was like an older brother, because I was a single child. And he came back from camp to die, 18. He had managed somehow or other to, he was so proud. He was lying in bed, and he was so proud that he had managed to die, to come back to die in his own bed. And I went to school, and every day from school I went to visit him as he was dying, every single day, and he could barely talk. Somebody had given him some American chewing gum, and he had it under his pillow for me as time I came, so he could give me something. And every day he asked me what I learned in school. And I cannot tell you the gentleness, the sweetness of this young boy who was still like an older brother to me, who still didn't lose his humanity, whatever he had gone through. That, and I can still see his eyes. I saw him just hours before he died, when he speak anymore. And I think that his look entered my eyes. I will never forget it. So that is part of my story.
I have put on the blackboard, for you who don't necessarily know the details, the time, the meanings, that is to say the identification which people who were sent to concentration camps had to wear. the name no longer played a role, but you were a number with a triangle, and the different triangles had different colors. Red, for example, were the politicals. Green were the people who were sent there because they are viewed as professional criminals. That means they were incorrigible criminals. Were the saboteurs. Pink were the homosexuals. And the Jews had a red and a yellow triangle which then made up a Jewish star. In the center of these triangles were the nationalities, the designation of the nationalities, which was the first letter of the German name of that particular country they came from. H, for example, P for Poland, T for Czechoslovakia, and so forth and so on, F for France, and what have you. So if you have any questions, please ask us the person you want to get the answer from. Any other questions? Well, yes.
Gloria, I was curious, did your mother and sister survive, and were you aware when you were leaving on the truck where you were going when you jumped off the truck?
Sister survived, and because the Russians liberated Auschwitz on January 27th, 1945, I believe it was on the 27th, and this was just a relatively short time after my separation from them. And of course, they thought I was dead, and they didn't know that I jumped off the truck. Yes, the answer to your second question is yes, I knew where the truck was going. It was heading to the gas chambers. The driver told us that it was heading to the gas chambers. Now, there is a gentleman here who worked in the Sonderkommando. He is in the audience, and you will have the privilege of hearing him on May 5th, who is very well informed in this area, and I respect him more than any must tell you that. Thank you for coming. But this gentleman enlightened me as to what may have happened to us at the time. He said that at that point they stopped gassing. We knew that they stopped gassing, but there still was a lot of work for us to do, and we were transferred to other jobs. However, he said that we were heading possibly to be shot rather than gassed, unless there were other groups who were to meet us there and gas together. There had to be apparently a minimum of about 100 or whatever to be gassed. Anyway, we were told that we were going to be gassed, and actually I jumped with the blessings of the driver, who was a Hungarian guard, who was our guard at Birkenau, and this is how he remembered me.
What do you mean you were jumping?
When he came to close the canvas in the back, he sort of looked in, and he said to me in Hungarian, "Te is," meaning you too. He remembered me from Brzezinka, from Birkenau. And my sister used to place things into his pockets. He never said yes, never said no, and my mother encouraged her to do this. I never dared do this, but that's how he remembered me, as the driver of this truck. And so when he saw me there, he said, those of us who would like to jump could jump off on the way, but if we are found, we're not to give him away, because both we and he would be killed, whereas he might save other lives yet. This is the first time I ever heard of this happen, but this is what happened to me. And I asked, no, he said it to all of us. And there were about 30 of us on this truck, and I asked who would with me, who would come with me, but nobody responded. I'm the only one who jumped off that truck, and there was someone from my hometown on that truck with me, and none of them survived.
Dr. Steiner, in your presentation, I got the feeling that you were probably a very assimilated German, and that you probably did not even consider yourself Jewish. But when you said they found that you had some Jewish ancestry, is that correct?
Well, just to clarify that, according to the Nuremberg laws, the definition of the Nuremberg laws, I was considered to be Jewish. One. Yes, I was brought up a Christian. Yes, I did not consider myself as German, but I consider myself to be Czech. Because I was born in Czechoslovakia, I was raised, I actually went to I went to an English kindergarten, I went to a German primary school and a Czech secondary school, and Czech university after the war. So yes, you're quite right. So I had certainly identity problems, because I was also a person when we were, for example, had to be deloused and all that. I was one of the people who was not circumcised, and that produced some sort of problems and all that. You see.
That must have been a very traumatic thing.
Yes, indeed. Yes, yes, absolutely. Yes.
I'd like to ask this gentleman, I don't remember his name.
Dr. Molho.
You were in Auschwitz all up to the liberation?
No, I was not in Auschwitz up to the liberation. On November of 1944, the Russians were coming, and we were taking in cattle trains, as explained, to Oranienburg, which is near Berlin, and then from then to Dachau, and I was liberated in Landsberg, which is just outside Dachau.
What I wanted to know was this. I was told that toward the end of the war, they ran out of that cyclone gas, and they stopped gassing the people. Is that not true? I hope that they burned them alive. Are you aware of that?
I am not aware of that. They did burn alive children, Hungarian children, because there was not enough room in the crematoria. So they opened pits and threw them in open pits. But I am not aware. Well, towards the end of the war, nobody was very keen about burning anymore, because of the, they were seeing the end.
Well, it's also gassing, because gassing was stopped in '44. And not because they ran out of the gas, but simply because conditions had changed to such an extent so that they began to change their policies.
Actually, I remember hearing children cry. Remember, I was just across the street from where this took place, and I remember their silence from where we worked. And the word got around, and I cannot say this for a fact because I wasn't there, but you will hear about this for a fact on May 25th. I hope you all will be here. But the word got around that they're not even gassing them to the extent that they did before. They're not even waiting until they're dead, and they drag them out before. And to this day, I just have a hard time listening to children cry because of it.
I think you brought up a very important point, and that's what I've noticed also, that under normal circumstances, if you had some of the disease, some of which I've had, are just about typhus, pneumonia, pleurisy, jaundice, you name it, I've had it all. And so I've, in spite of it, yes, it is difficult to explain. I don't think we have an explanation yet. I don't know what the cause was that we could survive under those circumstances, that is in terms of disease and what have you, and including frostbite. But one mustn't forget that how many people died, of course. And what you see here is an exception to the rule. So therefore that is something which should not be overlooked.
May I comment on that, please? I had 4 major operations as a result of my malnutrition problem. I was only 14, I was still growing, and obviously my body started consuming itself. And I had very strange problems, and one specialist sent me to another. Finally, a 70-year-old, a doctor who stopped operating at the age of 70, said, the last time I saw something like this was after the 30s, when people suffered from malnutrition. But he didn't know about my background. But where would you have suffered from malnutrition? I told him, oh, do I have a story for you, doctor? And so the end result was that my shoulders developed properly. There was not enough room for the shoulders for my arms to be turned or moved. After a while, they just simply closed in. There was only 1/4 of the room that there should have been. So consequently, they had to release that pressure through removing some of the bone structure, the shoulder bone, and, well, I won't go into detail, but also with the back. Both and the back have been operated on as a result of this problem.
I have to make a comment on that too. It's that the physical scars are not as deep as the psychological scars that we all have.
I would like to.
Yes.
I would like just to add. You hear very often expressions, sayings, that the Jewish people were going to the Shechita, to the camps, as sheep, to a clear, how would you say it then? Right. I would like you to remember that the Jewish people resisted physically and spiritually. Physically, in the ghettos, the ghetto in Warsaw, other ghettos in Vilna, and in the concentration camps. Sobibor, which was a concentration camp where men were situated, and they did resist. And citizens who fought bravely in the woods for their loved ones, perished in the concentration camps, in the ghettos. We partisans, we didn't know about the people in the concentration camps. And I'm sure that the people in the concentration camps, they didn't know about us partisans, that we resisted. But I want you to remember that Jewish people did resist.
Oh, indeed. In Sobibor, I think there were 300 inmates who broke out of Sobibor, and most of them were caught. I think 600 broke out, and about 300 were managed to escape, and most of them were caught. And last year there were 17 alive. I know one of these 17 who visited us in San Francisco. He lives in Santa Barbara, and heard his story. Tom Blunt is his name, and he's known very well. And it is against tremendous odds that these Jews resisted. In some cases, tunnels were dug under the electric wire fences. And of course, as they appeared on the other end, they were just shot down. And those at the other end of the tunnel didn't know what's happening to them. There were, and in the Warsaw Ghetto, through the tunnels, children were sent into towns to beg for bread and foods to bring into the ghetto. There were resistance is a subject by itself, and it must be known that it existed, but very little talked about.
I just wanted to add that during the time I was in Auschwitz-Birkenau, two of them escaped. One was brought back, the other one was not. And that was done with the aid of SS, by the way, which was a very interesting thing. When I was in Theresienstadt, a buddy of mine who was in the room with me, along with other people, decided to escape, and I gave him a lot of food and saved for him and all that. And he was able to escape because Theresienstadt was not that difficult to escape from. What was difficult, it was not that people were not willing to escape, but they didn't have a place to escape to, which was the problem. Now, he did because he was half Jewish and had some non-Jewish relatives. So they gave him refuge. From there, he made it to Austria and was able to make it Great Britain. And I accidentally met him in Prague after war. To say, well, I meet you on Broadway, right? So I met him in Prague, and there he was fighting for the British, was in the military fighting for the British, and that's where we met. He made it to Great Britain and became a soldier. And that, of course, was very encouraging. Most people who escaped were not necessarily successful in it, but they were caught again, and then, of course, they came to a very bad end. You had, yes?
As a predominantly Catholic anyway, so my question is, were they people that helped you coincidentally Catholic, or was it sort of an unofficial act of the church within France? Because I have a friend whose mother survived. Her whole family was wiped out, and she was in Paris that day and was smuggled out by a friend and spent the war years in a convent. So to me, that implies some sort of official participation by the church. You know, I guess I want to clarify to what extent did the church in France help?
You know, actually, this is a painful subject because from the highest authorities, the Pope simply said, you know, don't meddle in affairs of Jews. Then you had to have individual priests or bishops or so on who thought it out by themselves and did differently. Now, the problem was that many of the Jewish children who were placed in convents, their parents either came back or didn't come back. If the parents did not come back, there were sometimes there were some very painful situations. They were not relinquished to the Jewish community. And that actually, in Europe, there are many nuns and priests who were the children of my generation, who were Jewish children of my generation. And it's difficult for the Jewish community to deal with because, I mean, they were helped to be alive physically, but then again, they are another form of the loss to the Jews as a people. And to go and disturb their life over much, you know, like traumas, you know, you can get so many and then what? And especially if you don't have the family who had the legal guardianship if the parents did not come back. There were some battles over it, and then in some ways the Jewish community sort of closed its eyes on it with a great sigh of pain, I know, in France. And there were some convents who did take the opportunity to get Jewish and convert them and keep them inside the church. You know, on the other hand, there were other Catholics who were very, very considerate and to their own pain, because if they took in Jewish children during the war, at their own risk, they got attached to them. And then they had to give them back, you know. And, you know, and they would grow up not Catholic probably and so on. I had the immense pleasure of seeing a year. I went back to the village, first place where I was, and I thought that the lady who had taken those 4 children was dead, but she was still there. And it had been 40 years. And I was so stunned, I didn't expect her to be there. I knocked at the door and to explain, you know, the old lady limping there, and I said, I'm from far away in time and space. I come from California, and I was here during the war. And she said, Odette, open the door. And I cannot tell you also that bond, a tremendous bond. And as it happened, she had been ill, and I visited. My son was there. We couldn't separate for 7 hours straight. We just, you know, everything. It was just wonderful. And she had pictures of us. It turned out she had boys and then grandsons. And she never had girls except for 4 Jewish girls, right, during the war. But she was the one who knew. The other people did not know. So her grandsons were around, and for the first time learned the story. And she was proud. Those people don't tell. It was natural for them to do it. They didn't make a fuss. They did what they thought was right, period. And they're sort of surprised if anybody calls them heroes, you know. But as it happened, and it was really very, very moving, but as it happened, a few months after I came back, and I took many pictures, and there was real joy, she died. And her children wrote me a lovely letter saying that she was convinced that the reason she had come back from the hospital that time is that God wanted to send her to me to close the circle of her life. Yeah. So those were individuals, you know, they... Huh?
As the Nazis spread throughout Europe, it must have not happened all at one time. What did the Jewish people think in various countries as it spread? And what about the incident in 1939 of the ship called the St. Louis, which the Jews did?
I think perhaps all of us wish to comment on it. I'd like to say this, that we lived near the Carpathian Mountains, and they jammed the radios. We couldn't get news, and we were completely isolated. We really didn't know what was happening elsewhere in other countries, except for the fact that the summer before we were taken away, I remember a man came down who claimed that he came from Poland, and he just got away from a mass murder, that they were shot into a mass grave which he and they had to help dig. He pretended to be dead, and in the darkness of the night, he climbed out and escaped, and he went across the Carpathian Mountains from community to community to warn the rest of the Jews as to what's happening to the Jews elsewhere under Nazi occupation. And do you know that nobody would believe him? He was thought of as a lunatic. But I remember his face to this day. To your, let's say, your second question about the St. Louis, I have here today also my husband, who came from Nazi Germany at the age of 15 to the U.S. to an uncle. His parents couldn't get out of Nazi Germany in time. Well, they did get out in time. My father-in-law was released from Dachau after Kristallnacht, and he heeded the suggestion of Senator Truman to just get out of Nazi Germany to whatever country will take my mother-in-law and father-in-law and brother-in-law. And the only port that was open to them was Cuba. At that time, it was free Cuba. And while they were in Cuba, the ship St. Louis pulled up, and my father-in-law, with a friend of his, rented a little boat and rowed out to the ship St. Louis, and there he saw a man he knew who sent his family ahead, and they were already in the United States, and he was going to join them. Now this ship went back, and because Cuba closed its doors and wouldn't anybody embark, and as you know, most of these people perished.
You've given us this information, and how would you like us to use it in a positive way?
The important thing is,
What's the question?
the question is, how can one utilize the information which we gave to the audience? The important thing is the question is, how can one utilize the information which we gave to the audience? And I think that's a very important point. My comment would be, to begin with, don't obey orders blindly. Simply ask the questions to justify whatever is being supposed to do. That's one thing. Another thing is, do not accept belief systems, ideologies in blind faith. Look at why you do what you do, and do not merely do something because someone who is dear and close to you, or someone who is an authority figure will tell you, we have to do this because I say so, or because we have believed it for ages, or because this is how I was brought up and have done it all the way, all the time, and therefore you should do it too. So before you do something which is not clear to you, and you have not really understood the proper justification of it, question it before you act it, particularly if it has important consequences. That would be perhaps one of the major things I would have to say to answer your question.
May I comment too?
Yes, indeed, by all means.
I think that the Holocaust was the end result of racism. And I think it is our duty to prevent it from happening again by eliminating prejudice and discrimination and hatred among human beings. It's us. It did not start with Hitler. It started way back. Racism cuts, the hurt of racism cuts very deep. One never gets over it. And I believe that we must appreciate what we have, our democracy, and work strengthening it all the time. And we must teach our children toward that end too.
I don't know what the laws are on trying not to work criminals or work criminal periods, but I'd like someone to comment on that, and how do each of you feel personally about war criminals being tried?
The young lady would like to know how we feel about war criminals to be tried, particularly those people who had a hand in concentration camps and destruction camps and who brought about this situation.
Would you like to go first?
No, it's all right.
All right, everybody's very polite. I feel that Nazi war criminals should be tried regardless of their age. The reason for this is that I feel if you let them go at any age, they can someday, some other criminal can say, well, we'll just hide out for about 42 years or so, just like we did after World War II, and play with it. Let future perpetrators know that they will be haunted to their dying day for committing this kind of crime.
Comment on that too, if I may. You know that there are more than 5,000 Nazis accepted in the United States to work on the H-bomb right after the war, and they're still around, good friends that get Social Security. You know that there were 5,000 children, Jewish children from Czechoslovakia who could have been saved during the war, exchanged for trucks, and no country would accept them, including the United States. Australia made the biggest comment that I will never forget, and nobody should. We have no racial problem at the moment. We don't want to start one. So the 5,000 Jewish Czechs kids died because nobody would accept them. And those are facts.
And you've given them information. What
Could you say your question louder, please?
You've given us this information, and how would you like us to use it in?
The important thing is, the question is, how can one utilize the information which we gave to the audience? And I think that's a very important point. My comment would be, to begin with, don't obey orders blindly. Simply ask the questions to justify whatever is being said you are supposed to do. That's one thing. Another thing is, do not accept belief systems, ideologies in blind faith. Look at why you do what you do, and do not merely do something because someone who is dear and close to you, or someone who is an authority figure will tell you, we have to do this because I say so, or because we have believed it for ages, or because this is how I was brought up and have done it all the way, all the time, and therefore you should do it too. So before you do something which is not clear to you, and you have not really under the proper justification of it, question it before you act it, particularly if it has important consequences. That would be perhaps one of the major things I would have to say to answer your question.
May I comment too?
Yes, indeed, by all means.
I think that the Holocaust was the end result of racism. And I think it is our duty to prevent it from happening again by eliminating prejudice and discrimination and hatred among human beings. It starts with us. It did not start with Hitler. It started way back. Racism cuts, the hurt of racism cuts very deep. One never gets over it. And I believe that we must appreciate what we have, our democracy, and work toward strengthening it all the time. And we must teach our children toward that end too.
Thank you very much for your patience and listening to us.
Dr. Steiner, my question is personal, so I didn't want to say it out loud, but my husband